On October 3rd, I found a report in the supplemental cabinet that I had not written yet. It was a half sheet of paper in blue ink, dated October 6th, 3 days in the future, and every word on it was in my handwriting. It described a hiker with permit 2025-0892 returning from Lyman Draw and telling me about a footbridge no ranger had ever built, a lake no map had ever shown, and a trail fork at a head wall where the trail does not fork. 3 days later, she walked through the station door and said exactly what the report said she would. That was when I stopped thinking the ranger station was keeping records of an impossible place. The records were maintaining it. And when I left Buckner Creek, the file followed me home. I didn't apply for the job at Buckner Creek Ranger Station because I wanted to work in the wilderness. I applied because the listing said administrative support, seasonal GS3 housing provided, and I needed all 4 of those things at once. I'd been living in Bellingham, working split shifts at a property management company and a copy center, and my landlord had just informed me that my building was being converted to short-term rentals effective September 1st. I had until August to find somewhere else. The Forest Service posting was for May through October. North Cascades National Forest, room and board included at the duty station. I filled out the application on my lunch break at the copy center, submitted it without reading the duty station description closely enough to realize how remote it was, and received a call from a woman in the Marble Mount District office 8 days later offering me the position. That's how I ended up at Buckner Creek, not because of the mountains, not because of the forest, because I needed a place to live and a paycheck, and the federal government was offering both in a single package. And I was 26 years old and had already held enough jobs to know that you don't ask too many questions about the ones that come with housing. Buckner Creek Ranger Station sits at the end of a 12-mile gravel road off the Cascade River Road, which is itself a 30-mile drive from the nearest town with a grocery store. The last 4 miles of gravel are rough enough that the crew truck bottoms out on the high center ruts if you take them too fast, and there's a drainage crossing at mile 10 that floods out for 2 or 3 days every major rain event, cutting the station off entirely. The station is a small compound, 3 structures arranged in a loose triangle in a clearing at the edge of old-growth Douglas fir. The main station building is a 1970s wood frame rectangle with green metal roofing and a covered porch. Inside, there's an office with a front counter, a radio room, a small archive closet, and a break area with a table and a coffee maker. Behind it sits the bunkhouse, 4 small rooms, shared bathroom, a kitchen that was last updated sometime during the Clinton administration. The third building is a maintenance shed filled with tools, fuel cans, and spare lumber. The compound sits at an elevation of about 2,000 feet at the confluence of Buckner Creek and a smaller unnamed tributary that comes down out of a drainage to the northeast. That drainage is called Lyman Draw on the topographic maps, though I would later learn that the rangers who'd worked the station rarely used that name in conversation. They called it the Upper Draw, or more often, simply Up There, accompanied by a slight gesture toward the northeast ridge. The kind of gesture that could mean anything and, I would eventually realize, meant something very specific. My job was straightforward, and for the first 3 weeks, I liked it. I processed wilderness permits, both the self-issued ones that hikers filled out at the trailhead kiosks and the in-person ones issued at the station counter for overnight trips. I maintained the station's filing system, which was partly digital, a simple database on a Forest Service laptop that was 15 years old and connected to nothing, and mostly paper. I answered the radio when the rangers were in the field. I kept the log of daily visitor contacts, recording who came through the station, what they were doing, where they were going, when they expected to return. I ordered supplies through the district office. I updated the trail condition board on the porch. I cleaned the common areas. I made coffee. It was clerical work in a beautiful and deeply inconvenient location, and I settled into it the way I'd settled into every previous job, by learning the systems, memorizing the filing logic, and making myself reliable enough that nobody had to worry about whether the office was running. The staff at Buckner Creek was small. There was Tom Harada, the district wilderness ranger, who'd been stationed there for 11 years, and who ran the backcountry patrol schedule for the entire Buckner Creek drainage and the adjacent wilderness zones. Tom was 53, lean, Japanese-American, raised in Wenatchee. He'd done stints with the Park Service, BLM, and 2 state agencies before landing at the Forest Service, and he had the demeanor of someone who had long ago stopped needing conversation to feel comfortable in a room. He gave clear instructions, answered questions directly, and did not explain things he considered self-evident. He was not cold. He was precise. And there is a difference, though it took me a few weeks to learn it. There was Colleen Voss, a seasonal ranger in her 4th summer at Buckner Creek, who handled most of the multi-day backcountry patrol loops. Colleen was 29 from Portland, studying hydrology during the off-season. She was warmer and more talkative than Tom, and she had a habit of leaving patrol notes that read almost like journal entries. She described the condition of specific campsites, the behavior of specific marmot colonies, the water clarity of specific creek crossings, with a level of precision that went well beyond what the reporting forms required. I liked her immediately. There was Pete Garza, a trail maintenance lead who was technically based out of the Marble Mount compound, but who used Buckner Creek as his field camp 3 or 4 days a week during the heavy maintenance season. Pete was cheerful and practical and largely uninvolved with the permit and patrol side of operations. He built water bars, cleared blowdowns, repaired footbridges, and left. And there was me, Lena Woodard, the office person, the one who stayed at the station while the others went into the mountains. I was fine with that. I've never been someone who needed to be at the center of the action. I liked being the person who kept the record straight, who made sure the paperwork reflected what was actually happening. There's a particular satisfaction in maintaining a filing system that works, in knowing that if someone needs to find a permit from 3 weeks ago or a patrol report from last month, it's exactly where it should be. That was my contribution. I made the paper make sense. The filing system was where I spent most of my indoor time, and the filing system was where I found the forms. The station's records occupied 4 filing cabinets in the back of the main office, behind the radio desk, against the east wall, where a high window let in a narrow bar of morning light that crossed the cabinet tops and disappeared by noon. 2 cabinets held standard permit records, organized by year in hanging folders, going back to 1994, when the current wilderness permit system was implemented across the forest. 1 cabinet held administrative records, staffing documents, supply orders, maintenance logs, seasonal opening and closing checklists. The 4th cabinet, slightly older than the others, with a dent in the upper right corner and a faded strip of demo tape on the front, was labeled Supplemental. I asked Tom about the 4th cabinet during my first week, because I was trying to build a complete mental map of the office systems, and I didn't want to discover 6 weeks in that there was an entire filing category I'd been neglecting. He was at the radio desk, logging the morning weather. He didn't look up. He said the supplemental cabinet contained miscellaneous field documentation that didn't fit standard reporting categories, unusual wildlife observations, informal trail condition notes, incident supplements that weren't formal enough for the district's digital incident database, but that the station kept for local reference. He said I probably wouldn't need to access it much, but that I should keep it organized if I did. I accepted that. It was a reasonable description. Every office I've worked in has had a version of the supplemental cabinet, the drawer where things go that don't fit the system, but that somebody decided were worth keeping. I didn't think about it again for 3 weeks. In early June, I was filing a batch of returned wilderness permits, the carbon copies that come back to the station after a permit holder completes their trip and drops the return slip at the trailhead kiosk or the counter. It's routine work. Check the permit number, match it to the original issuance, note the return date, file it in the current year's folder. I was halfway through a stack of 12 when I found a loose sheet of paper clipped to one of the return permits with a small black binder clip. It was a half-sheet standard letter paper cut in half horizontally unlined with handwritten notes in blue ballpoint ink. There was no form number printed on it, no header, no Forest Service logo, no OMB control number, just a permit number written at the top, a date, and then a series of short observational notes in a format I didn't recognize from any of the reporting templates I'd been trained on. The permit it was clipped to belonged to a solo backpacker named David Yoon, who'd completed a 4-day loop through the upper Buckner Creek drainage. The trip had been uneventful according to his return slip. No incidents, no injuries, no wildlife encounters requiring documentation. A routine permit. The attached half-sheet read, in handwriting I didn't yet recognize but would later confirm was Tom's. Permit 2, 024-0471. Return contact June 2nd. Subject presented as station counter 11:40 a.m. Gear condition consistent with stated itinerary. Physical condition normal. No visible distress, injury, or unusual fatigue. Oriented to date and time. Conversational affect normal. Spatial reference. Described junction at headwall of Lyman Draw as the fork where the left trail goes down to the lake. No mapped fork exists at headwall. No lake present in upper drainage per current survey, aerial, or satellite imagery. This is the third independent description of this junction in the current season. Subject also used word clearing to describe area near upper terminus of draw, approximately 5,200 feet. No clearing exists per current survey area is continuous canopy transitioning to Krumholtz and Talus. Previous season references, Permit 0387, May 22nd, Permit 0401, May 26th, Form filed to supplemental. I read it twice. Then I read it again, more slowly, paying attention to the specificity of the language, the careful distinction between no mapped fork exists and subject-described junction, the cross-referencing to earlier permits, the note about filing destination. This wasn't a casual observation scribbled in the margin of someone's paperwork. It was a structured, deliberate record. Someone Tom had interviewed a hiker after his trip, noticed that the hiker described geographic features that did not exist, documented the discrepancy in a specific and consistent format, and filed it in the supplemental cabinet. I pulled David Yoon's original permit. It was standard. 4-day trip, Buckner Creek trailhead to the upper draw. Overnight at the Basin Rim Camp. Return via the same route. No special conditions. No incident. He'd come back on schedule, returned his permit, and presumably driven home to wherever he came from. The half sheet was something else. It was a record of something that the standard permit system had no category for. A hiker who came back from the backcountry, describing a landscape that didn't match the landscape he'd walked through. I opened the fourth cabinet. The supplemental files went back to 1987. They were organized by year in manila folders, each folder containing anywhere from 3 or 4 to over 30 of these half-sheet observation forms. The format was remarkably consistent across decades: permit number, date, return contact observations, spatial references, cross-references to related entries. Though the handwriting changed as the years progressed, I would eventually identify 5 distinct hands across the 38-year span, corresponding to the succession of wilderness rangers who had staffed Buckner Creek over that period. The earliest surviving forms were written by someone whose signature I found on a 1988 entry, R. Kowalski, then a brief period, 1989 to 1991, of forms in a different hand I couldn't initially attribute to anyone. Then a long, steady stretch of almost 15 years, 1992 through 2006, in the careful, small print of a ranger named Margaret Sow. Then a few sparse years of entries by someone I later identified as Tom's immediate predecessor, a ranger named Keith Duvall, who had apparently been at the station only 2 seasons before transferring. Then Tom's entries, beginning in 2014 and continuing through the current year, in the angular, efficient hand I now recognized from the David Yun form. The forms all followed the same general observational pattern: a permit number, a return contact date and time, a description of the permit holder's physical presentation upon return. Were they tired, alert, confused, normal? Were they oriented to the date and time? Was their gear consistent with the trip they said they'd taken? Then the spatial references the core of each form, which documented, in careful and specific language, things the returning hiker said about the Lyman Draw drainage that did not correspond to the actual terrain as mapped, surveyed, photographed, or experienced by the rangers themselves. I spent 3 consecutive evenings in the office reading through the cabinet after the others had gone to bed. The bunkhouse was 50 feet from the station building, and I could see its lit windows through the office's side window as I worked. I did not read every form. There were over 400, and many were repetitive in structure, if not in specific content. But I read enough of them, across enough years and enough hands, to identify the central pattern. And the pattern was this: a certain percentage of hikers who entered Lyman Draw and traveled into the upper drainage above approximately 4,000 feet, where the creek narrowed and the valley walls steepened, and the forest transitioned from the massive old-growth Douglas fir of the lower elevations to a thinner, wind-stressed mix of mountain hemlock and subalpine fir, came back describing features of the landscape that did not exist. Not dramatic impossibilities, not monsters or portals or glowing lights. Specific, consistent, mundane geographic features. A trail fork at the head wall where the draw crested the ridge. A small alpine lake in a hanging valley accessible via the left branch of that fork. A clearing near the upper terminus of the draw with a large rock cairn at its center. And a footbridge, rough-hewn logs. No railing, spanning about 8 feet of creek at approximately 4,800 feet elevation. These features appeared on no map, no USGS topographic sheet, no Forest Service trail inventory, no aerial photograph, no satellite image. They were not listed in any guidebook or trail description I could find. They did not exist, and yet they were described, independently and without collusion, by hikers spanning 38 years of records, in language that varied in its surface details. Each person noticed different things, framed the description differently, used their own vocabulary, but that converged on the same underlying geography with a consistency that was, to me, as someone who had spent her professional life filing and cross-referencing documents, unmistakable. The footbridge was the one that struck me hardest, because it was the most physically specific and the most consistently described. It appeared in forms from 1989, 1994, 1997, 2003, 2008, 2011, 2017, 2021, and 2024. 9 independent descriptions across 35 years. Every description placed it at approximately the same elevation. Every description noted the rough-hewn logs. 6 of the 9 mention the absence of a railing. 2 mention a cairn on the east bank marking the approach. One hiker in 2003 said the bridge needed maintenance. A couple of the logs are getting soft. Another in 2021 said, the logs are still solid, but they're old. They were describing the same structure, a structure that does not exist, has never existed, and that Colleen Voss, who had patrolled that section of creek dozens of times across 4 seasons, confirmed was not there. The creek at that elevation is a simple way to cross, shin deep in the summer low water, knee deep in the spring snowmelt. No bridge, no cairn, no structure of any kind. The lake was described by 11 hikers across 22 years. A small alpine body of water, roughly 2 acres, dark-surfaced, sitting in a hanging valley that was accessible from the headwall fork, the fork that also does not exist. The lake was ringed, according to various accounts, with heather and broken talus. The water was still. 3 hikers mentioned seeing fish rise. One woman, in 2008, said she'd filtered drinking water from it. Another, in 2017, described sitting on a flat rock at the lake's eastern edge and eating lunch while watching clouds reflect on the surface. The descriptions were specific and sensory and calm. These were not people recounting hallucinations. These were people describing a lake they had visited, in the same tone they would use to describe any other lake on any other hike. The lake does not exist. The topographic maps show a continuous ridgeline at that position, with no depression, no basin, no hanging valley capable of holding water. Satellite imagery, which I checked on the station's ancient laptop, pulling up the most current views I could access, confirmed bare rock, snowfield, and a narrow scree chute. No water, no lake, not even a seasonal tarn. And yet, 11 people had been there, filled their water bottles, watched fish rise, eaten lunch on a rock at its edge. They remembered it clearly. They described it without hesitation. They had no reason to think they were describing something impossible, because to them it had been as real and as ordinary as the creek crossing 1,000 feet below it. I brought the forms to Tom on a Thursday evening. He was sitting on the station porch with a ceramic mug of coffee that had gone cold, watching the last light move across the northeast ridge, the ridge that rose above Lyman Draw. The sky behind it was turning the color of a bruise, purple-gray with a streak of orange at the horizon. I set a stack of about 30 forms, spanning multiple decades, on the bench next to him, and sat down in the other chair. "I've been reading the supplemental files," I said. He looked at the stack, then at me, then back at the ridge. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A slight settling, like a man who has been waiting for a weight to arrive and feels it land. "I figured you would eventually," he said. "Tom, these go back almost 40 years. Longer than that, most likely." Kowalski, the ranger who started the forms, told Margaret Sow that he'd been keeping informal notes since 83 or 84, but the earliest ones that survived the filing cabinet are from 87. "There's water damage on the bottom of the cabinet. It flooded in here during a storm in 91. And anything that was in the lowest drawer before that date was lost." Before Kowalski, there might have been earlier records. There's a reference in one of the old station logbooks from the 1960s. It's in the archive box under the radio desk. You can look at it, to a ranger named Bill Odem, who kept what he called a discrepancy list for the Lyman Draw drainage. The logbook mentions it once and never again. I've looked for Odem's list. I've never found it. It may have been lost in the same flood, or it may never have been a formal document. "Tom, these people are all describing the same places. The bridge, the lake, the fork at the head wall, the clearing with the cairn. Yes, those places don't exist. They don't exist on the map. They don't exist when we go up there and look for them. They don't exist in any photograph or survey or satellite image." "That is correct. Then what are these people seeing?" Tom picked up the mug, looked into it, set it down again. He took his time with the silence the way he took his time with everything, not avoiding the question, but giving it the room he felt it required. A Steller's jay screamed somewhere in the fir canopy behind the station. The creek murmured below the compound. The ridge was darkening. "I don't know what they're seeing," he said. "I know what they describe when they come back. I know the descriptions have been consistent for decades, and I know that the people who give them are not confused, not impaired, not under the influence of anything, and not lying. They walked a version of the upper drainage that includes features the drainage does not include, and they remember it clearly. And the version they walked matches what other people they've never met, people who were up there years or decades before them, describe in the same terms. That's what I know. That's what Kowalski knew. That's what Sow knew. None of us have ever known more than that." "Does anyone else know about this? The district office? The regional office?" "The district office knows that Buckner Creek Station maintains supplemental observation files on visitor contacts. It's referenced in our station operating plan as locally maintained field notes. They've never asked to see the files. The files aren't in a format that fits any official reporting category. There's no form number, no database field, no incident type code. For hiker describes geographic features that do not exist. They're just notes, ranger notes, kept at the station, by the station staff, in a cabinet that's been here longer than any of us. Tom, there are over 400 of these forms. 423, as of last month. I count them at the end of each season. He paused. Not everyone who goes into Lyman Draw comes back describing the extra features. Most people don't. I've tracked the ratio for the years I've been here. It's roughly 1 in 15 to 1 in 20 permit holders for the upper drainage. Some seasons it's higher. The summer of 2019, it was nearly 1 in 10. Some seasons it drops. There was a year, 2016, when nobody triggered it at all, and I spent that winter wondering if it had stopped. It hadn't. The following May, the first permit return of the season described the footbridge. Is there a pattern? Demographics, experience level, anything? I've looked. Sal looked before me. Men and women, young and old, solo hikers in groups, though it's more common in solo hikers, which may be a function of attention or may just be sampling bias, since solo hikers are more likely to give detailed route descriptions at the counter. Experienced backcountry travelers and first-timers. No pattern I've found. The only constant is the itinerary. They entered Lyman Draw and traveled into the upper drainage above 4,000 feet. We sat with that for a while. The ridge was a black line now against a sky that still held a faint green glow at its base. The temperature was dropping. I could smell the particular cold earth scent that the forest floor released in the evenings as the air settled. There's something else, I said. I found a form in the 1986 folder. It's different from the others. It's filed by Kowalski, but the form is about Kowalski himself. He went into the draw. He came back, and he filled out a supplemental observation form on his own return. He described the bridge, the lake, the fork, the clearing, all of it, in his own handwriting, dated September 14th, 1986. Tom's hand, which had been resting on his knee, went still. Not tense, just still. You found that one. I found it, and I found something else. After that date, after September 14th, 1986. Kowalski's handwriting on the forms doesn't change, but the language does. The forms he wrote before that date, the ones about other hikers, are precise and detached, clinical. Subject described fork at headwall. No mapped fork exists. Observational. Neutral. The forms he wrote after September 14th are still precise, but the framing shifts. He starts writing things like, consistent with my own observation at the headwall, and cairn placement matches my field note from September 14th. He stops describing what hikers reported about a place he's never been. He starts comparing their descriptions to a place he has been. He becomes a corroborator instead of a documenter. Yes, that's what happened to Kowalski. He went in and saw it himself, and after that, he was a different kind of observer. He was a different kind of observer, Tom repeated. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it, a weight or a care that I recognized as the sound of someone who has thought about something for a very long time and has not resolved it. Margaret Sow took over the station and the files when Kowalski retired in 1988. She called him once, in 1991, to ask about the supplemental forms and get his guidance on maintaining them. He told her everything I've told you. He also told her one other thing. Tom stopped. The J had gone quiet. The creek was the only sound. He told her that after he came back from the upper draw, his sense of distance was different. Not dramatically, not in a way that impaired his work or his daily functioning. But when he looked at the ridge from this porch, the actual physical ridge, it seemed closer than it used to. And when he drove the gravel road into Marblemount, the road seemed longer, not by miles, by a feeling. The proportions of the landscape around him had shifted, subtly, as if his internal reference for distance had been recalibrated by the place he'd walked through in the draw, and now everything else was being measured against that reference, and some things came up slightly short, and other things came up slightly long. Did it go away? He didn't say it went away. Margaret's note from the phone call, she wrote it on one of the half-sheets naturally and filed it in the supplemental cabinet, just says, K reports persistent spatial recalibration following September 14th, 86 entry. No functional impairment. Does not consider it a problem. Considers it a change. That's the last reference to Kowalski in any of the station's records. I looked at the ridge. I tried to estimate how far away it was. A mile? 2? I realized I had no confident answer, and that the absence of confidence felt different tonight than it would have felt a month ago before I'd read the forms. Has it happened to you? I asked. Have you gone into the upper draw? Tom was quiet for a long time, not the comfortable quiet of a man who doesn't need to talk, but the careful quiet of a man choosing what to say. I have never entered Lyman Draw above the 4,000-foot line, he said. In 11 years at this station, I have never gone past the lower section of the drainage. The lower section below 4,000 is normal, unremarkable. It matches the map. It matches the survey. It matches itself every time you walk it. I patrol the lower section regularly. I do not enter the upper section. Colleen patrols the upper section. She's done it dozens of times. She has never described the bridge, the lake, the fork, or the clearing. She has never filed a supplemental form about her own experience. In 4 seasons, the upper draw has presented itself to her exactly as it exists on the map. Why her and not the hikers? I don't know. I have a theory, but it's only a theory. Colleen goes into the upper draw repeatedly, professionally, with a specific focus on trail conditions and campsite inventories. She traverses the drainage with a ranger's spatial awareness. She knows every switchback, every creek crossing, every campsite by name and GPS coordinate. Her internal map of the terrain is precise and deeply established. My theory is that whatever the mechanism is, it can't operate on someone whose spatial reference for the drainage is already locked in by repeated professional contact. It needs someone who is encountering the terrain for the first time, someone whose internal map is still forming, still open to being written, a hiker passing through once, a first-time visitor, someone whose impression of the landscape is still wet, still taking shape. Kowalski went in once. Kowalski had never patrolled the upper section. He'd been a station ranger. Like me, he worked out of the compound, managed the permits and the files, and left the backcountry patrols to his seasonal staff. When he went into the upper draw on September 14th, 1986, it was his first time above 4,000 feet in that drainage. He was a first-time visitor to his own jurisdiction, and the drainage treated him like one. I understood. I also understood why Tom had never gone above 4,000 feet. It was not cowardice, and it was not indifference. It was the same logic that keeps an archivist from writing in the margins of the documents she preserves. He was the observer. He maintained the record. If he went in and came back changed, even subtly, even in a way that didn't impair his function, the observation framework would be compromised. He would stop being a documenter and become, like Kowalski, a participant. The forms needed a documenter, someone who had never seen the bridge and could therefore record others' descriptions of it without the contamination of their own experience. For 11 years, Tom had kept himself clean. 11 years of reading other people's accounts of a place that couldn't exist, filing them carefully, counting them at season's end, and never once going to see for himself. The discipline that required was something I was only beginning to appreciate. The summer continued. I processed permits. I filed supplemental forms when Tom clipped them to return permits. I developed an eye for which return contacts might produce an observation, not because there was a visible pattern in the hikers themselves, but because I began to recognize a particular quality in the way certain people talked about their trip. Most hikers came back and described their route in practical terms: the mileage, the elevation gain, where they camped, how the weather was. The ones who had been to the other version of the draw described it that way too, but embedded in their practical descriptions were references to things that should have been ordinary but weren't. A bridge, a fork, a lake delivered with the same casual confidence as every other detail. They didn't emphasize these features. They didn't flag them as unusual. That was the tell. The features were so seamlessly integrated into their experience that they had no reason to think anyone would find them noteworthy. That was the thing that stayed with me at night in the bunkhouse, lying in my narrow bed listening to the creak through the open window, not the impossibility of the geography, the seamlessness of the experience. These people had walked through a landscape that included features the landscape doesn't have, and it had felt exactly like walking through a landscape that does. There was no transition, no shimmer, no threshold, no sense of crossing from one version of the terrain into another. They went in. The trail forked where the trail doesn't fork. A bridge appeared where no bridge exists. A lake sat in a valley that isn't there. And they experienced it all with the complete, unremarkable conviction of ordinary perception. They came out carrying the memory of a place that was as real to them as any place they'd ever been. And they had no way to know it was wrong, because from inside the experience, it wasn't wrong. It was just the trail. In August, I began asking careful questions at the permit counter during return contacts. Not leading questions. I never said, "Did you see a bridge?" Or, "Was there a fork at the head wall?" I asked open-ended things. How was the creek crossing in the upper section? Most hikers said what Colleen would have said. Fine, cold. I just waded through. But every few weeks, someone would say, "You mean at the bridge?" Or, "Which crossing, the lower wade or the one with the footbridge?" And I would keep my face neutral and note the permit number on a scrap of paper under the counter and feel the specific quiet chill that came from watching an ordinary person describe an impossible thing with total, justified confidence. In early September, Colleen returned from a 5-day patrol loop that included 2 nights camped in the upper drainage. She sat at the break table filling out her patrol report while I filed at the cabinet behind her. Her report was detailed and precise, as always. Trail conditions on the upper section, campsite inventories, creek levels at each crossing. She noted the exact water depth at 3 points, measured with a hiking pole marked in inches. Wildlife observations, a marten near the 5,000-foot camp, fresh bear scat on the trail at 4,600 feet, a pair of gray jays at the head wall. No bridge, no lake, no fork. No clearing with a cairn. She had been in the same drainage, at the same elevations, in the same week. The 2 different hikers had returned describing the full suite of non-existent features. The drainage had shown her the version that matched the map. It had shown them something else. I asked her about it that evening, as casually as I could. "Colleen, have you ever noticed anything in the upper draw that struck you as inconsistent with the topo map? Any features that seemed off? Or terrain that didn't quite match what you expected?" She considered the question seriously. She was someone who took spatial accuracy personally. "No," she said. "The upper draw is pretty straightforward, steep, rocky, a little exposed near the head wall, but it matches the topo sheet. I've compared them enough times to be confident. Why? Some hikers have described features up there that I can't reconcile with the map. A bridge, a fork near the head wall." She shrugged, though not dismissively. "People get turned around in drainages. Everything looks similar when you're tired and the terrain is steep. They might be conflating it with somewhere they've been before. I've had hikers describe the wrong trailhead to me at the counter. They think they came in from the south when they came in from the north. Memory is weird in the backcountry." I let it drop. She was not wrong about memory. but I had 423 forms in the cabinet that said this was something other than confused recollection, and the consistency of the descriptions across nearly 4 decades made the conflation theory untenable to anyone who had read the file. October came. The season wound down. Permit volume dropped to a trickle as the weather turned cold rain, morning frost on the porch railing, fog filling the valley until noon. The upper elevations were dusted with early snow. Colleen finished her last patrol loop and drove home to Portland on October 2nd. Pete wrapped his final maintenance project and left the same week. The station was quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. On October 3rd, I was alone at the station. Tom was on a day patrol on the south side of the district, well away from Lyman Draw. Pete was gone for the season. I was at the desk working through the end-of-season filing, reconciling permit records, closing out supply orders, updating the station inventory. I opened the supplemental cabinet to file the last batch of observation forms from September. There were 4 of them, all in Tom's handwriting, all routine by the standards of the cabinet. I placed them in the current year's manila folder. As I did, I noticed a form near the back of the folder that I hadn't seen before. It was in the same half-sheet format, same blue ballpoint ink, but the handwriting was not Tom's. The handwriting was mine. I pulled the form out slowly. My hands were steady, but something in my chest was not. I held it under the desk lamp and read it. Permit 2025-0892, return contact October 6th, subject presented at station counter 2:15 p.m., gear condition consistent with stated itinerary, physical condition normal, oriented to date and location, conversational affect slightly elevated, described trip as the best hike I've ever done. Spatial reference described the clearing at the upper terminus of the draw as open, maybe half an acre, with a big cairn in the center and a view down to the lake. Referenced the footbridge at approximately 4,800 feet. The logs are in good shape. I was surprised how solid it was. Referenced the headwall fork. I took the left branch down to the lake and then came back up and continued on the main trail. 4th independent description of the headwall fork this season. First, to describe both the fork and the lake access trail in connected sequence. Form filed to supplemental. The date on the form was October 6th, 3 days from the day I was reading it. The permit number, 2025-0892, had not been issued yet. I checked the permit log on the laptop. The most recent permit issued was 0879. Numbers 088, 0 through 0900 were unassigned. The hiker described in this form had not yet received a permit, had not yet entered the drainage, had not yet returned, and I had not written the form. I had no memory of writing it, no memory of processing permit 0892, no memory of speaking to the hiker it described. But the handwriting was not a copy of my handwriting. It was not a forgery. It was my handwriting in the way that my face is my face, not approximated, but identical, down to the specific pressure variations I make on certain letter combinations, the way my lowercase k leans slightly rightward, the way I form quotation marks with 2 quick strokes instead of curved marks. I had been filing forms in this format for 5 months. I knew what my version of the format looked like. This was it. I put the form on the desk. I pressed my palms flat on either side of it and breathed. The office was silent except for the low hiss of the radio on standby and the distant sound of the creek. Through the window, the ridge to the northeast was half hidden in cloud. I tried to construct explanations. Someone had accessed samples of my handwriting from the filing cabinet and reproduced it on a fresh form, but the reproduction was too perfect, and there was no one at the station to do it. I had written it myself in some altered state, but I had no history of sleepwalking, fugue states, or dissociative episodes, and I had been sleeping normally in the bunkhouse with no evidence of nighttime activity. The form had been planted by an outside party, but the station was 12 miles from the nearest paved road. The office was locked each night, and there was no sign of entry. None of the explanations worked. What was left was the form itself, a document in my handwriting, in the format I used, describing an event that had not occurred yet, filed in the cabinet where it belonged. That evening, Tom returned from his patrol. I showed him the form. He read it without expression, slowly, carefully, the way he read everything. Then he opened the supplemental cabinet and looked at the folder, confirming where I'd found it and where it sat in the sequence relative to the other forms. "This is your handwriting," he said. "Yes." "You did not write it." "No." He held the form for a long time, turning it slightly in the light. Then he said, "Margaret Sow's last season was 2013. She'd been maintaining the supplemental files for 22 years. In the last month of her final season, she found a form in the cabinet in her own handwriting, dated a week ahead of the day she found it, describing a return contact she had not yet conducted. She told me about it when she trained me as her replacement that October. She said it was the reason she decided to retire." "What did she do with the form?" "She left it in the file. She told me she'd considered removing it, tearing it up, burning it, taking it out of the record, but she said she couldn't determine whether removing it would be an act of correction or an act of destruction. The form was accurate in every observable way. It was in her handwriting, in her format, in her filing sequence. It belonged in the cabinet. She didn't feel she had the authority to remove a document from a record she was responsible for maintaining, even if the document shouldn't have existed." "Did the predicted event happen?" "On the date written on the form, a hiker returned from Lyman Draw and described the cairn in the clearing at the upper terminus, exactly as the form described. Margaret conducted the return contact, wrote her observation on a fresh half sheet, and then compared it to the pre-existing form. They were identical, word for word. She had written the same sentences in the same order with the same details, because those were the details the hiker provided, and that was how Margaret had always structured her observations. The form hadn't predicted her words, it had predicted her process. It knew how she would document the contact, because the cabinet had 22 years of her documentation patterns inside it. It could generate her output, because her output had become that consistent, that characteristic, that predictable. The word sat in the air between us. Predictable. The cabinet had 4 months of my forms, 4 months of my handwriting, my observational habits, my sentence structures, my attention to certain types of detail. It had learned me the way any system learns a regular input, not through intelligence, but through accumulation. "Tom, what is the cabinet?" "It's a filing cabinet. It holds forms. It's been holding forms since at least 1987 and probably longer. I don't know what it is beyond that. I don't know whether the forms generate the phenomenon in the draw or the phenomenon generates the forms. I don't know which came first. I've thought about it for 11 years and I don't know." "Have you ever thought about destroying the files?" He looked at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, his expression showed something that wasn't patience or precision. It was something closer to pain. "Every winter," he said, "every winter when the station is closed and I'm at my apartment in Cedro Woolley doing off-season work, I think about driving up here and emptying that cabinet and burning every form. And every spring when I open the station, I walk in and check the cabinet first thing, before I turn on the radio, before I start the water heater, and the forms are all there, in order, and there are sometimes 1 or 2 new ones that weren't there when I closed the station in October, in handwriting I recognize, filed correctly. I didn't ask whose handwriting. I didn't need to. The cabinet maintained itself. It had always maintained itself. The Rangers were the mechanism of maintenance, but the impulse to maintain, to file, to preserve, to keep the record accurate and complete did not originate with them. It originated with the system, and the system had been running for at least 40 years, possibly 60, staffed by a succession of careful, conscientious, detail-oriented people who were drawn to the work because they were the kind of people who keep good records, and who kept good records because the work drew that out of them. And the distinction between those two things had been dissolving for decades. October 6th arrived. I sat at the counter and waited. I had considered not being there, driving to Marble Mount, calling in sick, finding any reason to be absent from the station on the date written on the form. But I understood, with a clarity that felt borrowed from the cabinet itself, that absence would not prevent the form from being accurate. The form did not require my cooperation. It required only my consistency. And I was consistent. That was the thing I was good at. That was the thing that had gotten me hired, and that had made me valuable, and that had made the cabinet's prediction possible. I was reliable. I showed up. I did the work. I filed things where they belonged. At 2:07 p.m., a woman pushed open the station door. Mid-30s, sunburned, a medium-sized pack with a sleeping pad strapped to the outside. She was smiling the particular smile of someone who has spent 3 days alone in the mountains and is ready for a hot shower, but not quite ready for the trip to be over. She unzipped a plastic bag and handed me her permit. I looked at the number, 2025-0892. Great trip, she said. Honestly, probably the best hike I've ever done. She described her route. Standard itinerary up Buckner Creek, into the draw, camp at the rim, day hike to the head wall, return. Then she said, the clearing at the top of the draw is incredible. Maybe half an acre, totally open, with this big rock cairn in the center. You can see all the way down to the lake from there. I took the left fork at the head wall down to the lake and spent the whole afternoon just sitting by the water. She mentioned the footbridge at 4,800 feet. She said the logs were in good shape. She said she was surprised how solid it was. I wrote it all down on a half sheet, blue ink, the format I'd used for 5 months. When she left, I pulled the pre-existing form from the cabinet and laid the 2 sheets side by side. Identical. Every word, every comma, every quotation mark. I had written the same observation twice, once in a form I don't remember producing, found 3 days early, and once just now, fully conscious, documenting exactly what the hiker said in exactly the language I always use. The cabinet had not controlled my hand. It had not dictated my words. It had simply known what I would write, because what I would write was a function of who I am and how I work. And it had known both of those things since June. I filed both copies. I don't know why I kept both. Probably because the record should reflect what happened, and what happened was that there were 2. Probably because I am the kind of person who does not discard documents. Probably because the cabinet expected me to keep both, and I could no longer distinguish between my professional instincts and its influence on them. I closed the station on October 14th. I cleaned the bunkhouse. I completed the end-of-season checklist. Tom walked me through the filing system closure, and when we got to the supplemental cabinet, he looked at me and said, "The next seasonal will need to know where these are and how to maintain them." Are you going to tell them what they are? I'll tell them what I told you. Miscellaneous field documentation, supplemental observations. They'll understand the rest when they're ready. Or they won't. Tom, what if they're not the kind of person who reads the files? They will be. The listing draws them. It always draws them. I drove back to Bellingham on October 15th. The gravel road was 12 miles, same as it had been in May. The odometer confirmed it, but the road felt longer, not by a measurable amount, but by a quality of experience that I can only describe as spatial unfamiliarity, as if the distances between curves and drainage crossings had been subtly rearranged. The highway was the same. The distance between towns was the same, but my sense of how far things were from each other had shifted, slightly and permanently, in a direction I could feel, but not correct. Everything was a little bit off. Not wrong, just reproportioned, as if my body had been given a new ruler and hadn't been told the old one was no longer valid. I knew what this was. I'd read Kowalski's account, spatial recalibration, but I had never entered Lyman Draw. I had never gone above 4,000 feet. I had never seen the bridge, or the lake, or the fork, or the clearing. I had only read about them 423 times. I had read about them in form after form, in 5 different handwritings, across 38 years, absorbing the descriptions the way a person absorbs a map, not by visiting the terrain, but by studying its representation until the representation becomes, in some functional sense, the territory. The cabinet had not sent me into the draw. It had brought the draw to me through the documents. 400 descriptions of a footbridge is not the same as crossing a footbridge, but it is also not nothing. It is, after enough repetitions, a kind of crossing. I found an apartment in Bellingham. I started a new job at a land trust that manages conservation easement records, filing, documentation, cross-referencing, the work I'm good at. 3 weeks after I returned, I was organizing a closet shelf, and I found a half sheet of paper tucked between 2 field guides I'd brought from the bunkhouse. It was in the standard format, blue ink, my handwriting, at the top a permit number I'd never seen, 2026-0211. Below it, a date, June 4th of the following season. Below that, a return contact observation for a hiker I have never met, describing the bridge, the lake, the fork, and the clearing in the flat. Careful language I would use if I were sitting at the Buckner Creek counter doing my job. I stood in my closet for a long time, holding a form from a station I no longer worked at, describing a contact 6 months in the future, in the handwriting of the version of me that the cabinet had learned to predict, the version that was consistent, the version that was reliable, the version that showed up and did the work and filed things where they belonged. I put the form in a manila folder. I labeled the folder with a marker, supplemental. I placed it in the small filing cabinet I keep in my apartment for tax records and insurance documents and the unremarkable paperwork of an ordinary life. I put it in the bottom drawer. I check the folder every morning before I leave for work. It has become part of my routine: keys, wallet, phone, folder. For the first 2 weeks, there was only the one form. Then, on a Tuesday in early November, the folder was slightly thicker. I could feel the difference when I pressed my thumb against the edge. A resistance, a density, that a single half sheet does not produce. I did not open it. I pressed my thumb to the edge and felt the additional pages and did not count them. I have not opened the folder since I first put the form inside. Every morning, I touch the edge. Every morning, it is slightly thicker than it was the morning before. Not by much, by the width of a half sheet of paper. One new form per day, or close to it, filed by no one, written by no one I can see, in handwriting I know without looking is mine. The Forest Service seasonal listing for Buckner Creek appeared in my email last week. GS3, Administrative Support, May through October, housing provided. The duty station description mentions records management and visitor contact documentation. The same listing I answered 1.5 years ago. For the same reasons, I needed the work. I needed the housing. The listing fit. I have not applied. I have not opened the listing since I first read it, but I noticed that I've read it 3 times, and that the 3rd time I read it, I had already pulled up the application portal in a separate tab, and that my cursor was resting on the Begin Application button when I caught myself and closed the browser. The listing closes on Friday. The folder is in the bottom drawer. I press my thumb to its edge each morning and feel it growing, one form at a time, building a record of contacts I haven't made in a place I haven't returned to, in the handwriting of a woman who is me in every way that matters and who is, apparently, already working. I don't know whether the forms are an invitation or a record. I don't know whether they are being generated by the cabinet at Buckner Creek or by whatever part of me the cabinet learned well enough to replicate. I don't know whether going back would satisfy the process or accelerate it. I don't know whether staying away is resistance or simply delay. What I know is this: the folder is real. The forms are real, the handwriting is real, and every morning when I press my thumb to the edge before I've had my coffee, before I've checked the weather, before I've done anything else, the gesture feels less like vigilance and more like what it probably is. It feels like maintenance. It feels like I'm checking the file. It feels like I am already, in every way that the record cares about, back at the station, at the counter, doing the only work the cabinet ever needed me to do. The listing closes Friday. I haven't applied. The folder is thicker this morning. My thumb knows the edge.